So in this video we are making these old school style space shelters. Now you will only need a few simple tools to build these space shelters: a knife, a ruler, and maybe some scissors. Oh, and a pen or two would also help. You will also need some adhesives such as PVA glue. You might even be able to get away with a glue gun. I don't have one of those. It is something on my list. However, the one thing that you will need the most of is time. These scratch built pieces of terrain do take a little bit of time. This one probably took around a couple of hours to build. I mean, speaking of scratch built terrain, do you prefer it homemade like this, or do you prefer the shop bought off the shelf plastic terrain? I want to know what you think. Do you prefer homemade or off the shelf? Let everyone know in the comments below. So anyway, let's dive in and have a look on how to build these space shelters. The first thing that you will need is a suitable cylindrical container. I found that the Pringles crisps tube look pretty handy for this. I think the various supermarkets do their own versions if you wanted to get a cheaper alternative. So the first thing we are going to need to do is empty the contents. That's such a shame, isn't it? It's a good thing I picked a tasty flavour: cream cheese and chive. Yum. To empty the tube, we need to pull the lid off. It's stuck on surprisingly well. I wonder what sort of glue they use. Next up, empty out your contents. I found eating the contents helped with this stage. My wife also helped, but sadly I'm on a diet, so I only got a handful. Honest. The next thing we need to do is cut the ends off. I used a Stanley knife for this. Be careful you don't slice your fingers. No trips to A&E today, please. You will see that there's some crispy, cheesy chive residue left coating the inside of the tube. But for now, I'm going to leave it, and I hope it doesn't bite me in the ass later. I also decided to remove the metal end, as I don't think I can cut through that with any of my tools. Again, I used my trusty Stanley knife to do this. Now the next few stages are a little tricky. We need to mark out a line down the centre of the tube to cut. I seem to have found the most convoluted way to do this. I'm sure there's an easier way, and if you know, please let us know in the comments below. I started off by using a straight piece of wood and drew a line with a permanent marker. I then took a sheet of paper and taped it to that line. You will see why shortly. You probably don't need as big a bit of paper as I have used. I then rolled the tube around my paper and marked on the paper when I was a full rotation around. I was basically measuring out the circumference. Experts in maths could probably do this a lot faster. When we unrolled the paper, we can see our mark, and our tube circumference is now a straight line. I felt quite clever at this part. I then took a ruler, but the only one I have is this huge metal one. It's far too big to maneuver around the desk easily. Please someone remind me to get a smaller one ASAP. And marked out the halfway point. I then rolled my newly marked paper back around my tube and used my new halfway point mark to mark it out onto the tube, and I did remember to do it both ends. I then took my wood and ran my marker along its length where the new marks are. I now have two lines nicely marked out onto my tube. Hopefully they are correct. The next thing you need to do is take a cutting implement and cut down those lines. Sadly, my original scissors were not up to snuff, so I had to bin them off for something else. I switched to my trusty Stanley knife, and it managed to cut through it quite nicely, if a little slowly. Again, if you use a knife, be careful you don't cut yourself. When you've made your cut, you should end up with this weird Pringles Pac-Man looking thing.
Waka waka waka.
Actually, I don't think that's Pac-Man. I think that might be the thing from the Muppets. Anyway, I love Pac-Man, and I need to play some more of that later. I was never any good at it though. Okay, so now we cut the other line. This will divide our tube into 2 half tubes. As I'm an idiot, I tried the terrible mini scissors again. What shall we try instead this time? I found another pair of longer scissors. These should work, but they have a weird furry thing going on with the handle. Did they melt once? Did a pet chew them? No idea. I honestly have no idea. Anyway, using these long scissors, we can finish the cut. It's much faster than the knife. We now have 2 long half tubes. We are well on the way to having some epic scenery now. The Pringles guy reminds me of Super Mario. It's-a me, Super Pringles Man. It was at this point I almost had a panic attack as they looked a little short, so I whipped out an Imperial Guardsman to test them out. Yep, he fits in there fine. A Primaris Marine might not fit, but Marines tend not to build bomb shelters, I imagine. This is a human creation, something they can hide in. Panic over, we then measure out half the length of the tube. This is much easier than getting the diameter, even with an overly large metal ruler. Using a permanent marker, I then marked out the halfway point. Again, feeling clever, I used the other tube to make a straight line at the marks by mounting it on top. I then had a nice line to draw along. Look how professional that looks. I should make videos on YouTube or something. Who am I kidding? Who on earth would want to watch that? I next cut down my newly marked line with my fairy-handled scissors, cutting the tube half into half again. I think we're on to quarters now, right? There we go. We now have 2 nice little space shelter bunker things. Well, the beginnings of them anyway. I only used 1 half of the tube, but you could actually make another 2 with the other half. I'm not overly happy with a couple of the ends. They are not quite straight enough, so I buttered them up to a box and drew a line with my pen of choice where I think it needed cutting. I then cut those lines on the end with my fairy-handled scissors to get a nice new clean straight end. The next thing we're going to need are some ends for our shelters. Again, I tried to be clever and used the Pringles lid to draw some semicircles onto card to be the walls. This goes a bit wrong later, as you will soon find out. I then cut those semicircles out with my scissors, this time the little green ones. You can see some tabs on there that I was originally going to use to attach them, but I decided against it and cut them off. Looking back, this might have been a mistake. If you can get the tabs to work, I would suggest using them. We now have 4 nice little semicircles. They look a bit like the segments from a Terry's chocolate orange, but I doubt they taste as good. As the semicircles were a bit too big, I had to trim a few millimeters off the bottom. I used a straight edge and a knife to do this. I had to do this because I used the lid of the tube as a template, which was too big. The mistake I just told you about earlier. Offering my little segments up to the shelter, I can see they now fit better. There's a little trial and error here, but luckily it's card and will bend around easily. I then marked out some little rectangles to use as the doors and door frames. I think they were around 25 to 35 millimeters, just big enough to fit on the ends of the shelter walls. Then I used one of the doors as a template to mark out the doorways onto both of the end walls. I only put doors on one end of the shelters. I guess you could put them on both ends if you wanted. Hell, you can do whatever you want. So I now have 2 shelter ends with doorways marked out and 4 doors. I want an inner and outer door, you see, but this will all make sense soon, hopefully. So again, using my ruler and pen, I marked out the door frames onto 2 of the doors. These were around 3mm wide. That is quite thin and did end up a little flimsy. Also ignore those diagonal lines I drew on mine. I tried to be clever here and failed. Next, using my scissors and the knife, I couldn't work out which was easiest, I cut the door frames out. You only need 3 sides of the door frame, the top and the sides. You won't need the bottom frame, even though I've stupidly marked it out. Again, not clever. Be careful when you cut these out, as they are quite fragile. Now, with the other 2 doors, I used my metal ruler and pen again to mark them out into 2 halves. This is to create a sliding door effect, kind of like the doors you see on lifts. So I then cut these doors in half where I marked them out using my scissors. It's going pretty well so far. Next up, we stick our door frames onto our shelter ends using those lines we previously drew as a guide. As I'm an idiot, I used super glue here, but really what you want to use is PVA glue. You need a bit of working time to tease them into place. When it's dry, you should have this. A door frame glued onto an end. It looks a bit wonky, but we can hide that in the painting stage. Honest. The next thing I do is take my pen and draw inside that door frame. This is to act as a sort of scribe line guide to cut it out with a knife. Once we've marked and scribed with the pen, we can then take our knife to cut that part out. We now have a nice hole with a nice chunky border around it. The next thing we do is glue our doors in, or on, depending on how you look at it. I was clever enough here to use the PVA glue and not super glue. This allowed me some working time to get them in the right place. I made one door closed, which I made by gluing the doors so that they meet in the middle. On the other one, we decided to have open doors. Well, half open anyway. I think this will look pretty cool when we paint it. The devil is in the details, or so they say. I decided that I wanted a button of sorts to open the door with, so I took some old sprue with a circular bit halfway down to be my illuminated buttons. I trimmed the other end off with my amazing Tamiya plastic cutters. These things are great, I can't recommend them enough. I then shaved away the excess plastic and cleaned it up with my knife. I think for a bit of terrain that's going to be good enough. You can go mad at the detailing stage if you like, but I tried to keep it simple. Using some more PVA glue, I then stuck my new button post, as I like to call it, to the front of my shelter next to the door. There we go, I think that will come out nice. We just have to wait for the PVA to dry now before we can move on to the next stage. Okay, so now that our ends are fully dry, we can now stick them in the ends of the roof. I apply a bead of PVA glue and push them in. Do this for all 4 ends and leave them a while to dry. They can be a bit fragile here. I have to admit, I spent a little while fiddling with them to get them like this. They are looking good though, if I don't say so myself. So for a little more detail, I wanted some roof strips. So I cut some paper into 1-inch strips using that massive metal ruler and my knife. I now have 6 strips of paper. That gives me 3 for each shelter. Let's hope these hold up to a little handling when built. They look a little flimsy. So I ran a bead over the roofs and stuck my strips on. I added a strip to each end and a strip in the middle. Using a pair of scissors, I snipped them to length on the shelter itself. To aid in the drying, I taped them down at the ends. They kept trying to curl up, and we can't be having that. Next up, we want to make a base for our shelters. I grabbed a piece of mounting board that I found laying about. Arrange the shelters onto the board in a way where you're using the edges of the board as the edges of the base. You could ignore that if you wanted a more rounded base edge, I suppose, but I was just trying not to waste the board. Mark out on the board where you have to cut it down to be the correct size. Again, I use a permanent marker for this. Using a knife and my big metal ruler, I then cut the base out to these new marked dimensions. I do apologise for my hairy arm being in shot instead of the actual cutting operation. You can see it in the reflection in the mirror on the opposite wall though, I guess. I fancied having rounded base corners, so using a 32mm base as a template, I drew the rounded corners onto the board. I then cut around these lines with my little green scissors. I'm not sure where the fluffy ones went. We now have a base that's cut to size with 4 nice rounded corners. Lovely. To stick the shelters to the base, I ran a bead of PVA glue all around the bottom. I tried to be careful not to let it run down the outsides though. Then I flipped them over and stuck them down to the base. I used an old Eldar codex to weigh them down while they dried. I mean, what else is an Eldar codex good for? It says here in my Eldar codex that if you're enjoying this video, then you should at least like the video and subscribe to the channel. That means you, Emma. We then need to find some filler. I found some laying around my work area that hadn't actually dried out. I have to admit, I was quite surprised. I've no idea how long that's been there. It's 151 all-purpose filler. I think it comes from QD. Q is for crap spelt wrong. D is for dipshit. That's what we sung back in the 90s when QD had TV ads. Yes, I'm old. Okay, so it's now time to smear your piece. Using a spatula, I've made my own, spread filler all around the edges of the base and try to sort of taper it off towards the edge. The next thing I did was scrape a little bit of filler away adjacent to where the entrances were to show a little footfall wear. Don't forget to add filler in between the shelters. I nearly did, and that would have been a huge fail. The next thing I did was clean up the messy bits where my filler had got onto my walls. I did not want that. So I took a wet paintbrush and smoothed the areas off, or even washed bits off in places until it was nicely clean and how I wanted it. When it's all clean and smooth, it reminds me of snow. Would this be a really easy way to do a snow base? It's time to add some texture to our base. Make sure the filler's dry before you move on to this stage. I start by decanting some PVA out onto a board. Then I brush on the PVA and then tip on the texture. In this case, it's a load of random grit sand. It takes a little while to do this. Remember those walkway things we scraped back? Yeah, those got filled in with texture, so I've had to re-scrape them back in again. When you're done, tip off any excess. Sadly, we appear to have missed a few bits, but don't worry, we can fix that. We just add a little more glue and a little more grit, and easy fix. Our base is now textured. Now looking back, I would probably want to make this thicker, maybe use some more filler on the base, or maybe another level of grit. I then pick up some of my homemade PVA sealant. It's PVA glue and water in around a 2-to-1 mix of water to PVA. It's in a spray bottle, so it's easy to apply. I use my spray bottle contraption to spray the mix all over the piece. I have protected my work area with paper and more greaseproof paper on top of that to catch any mess that we might make. And we will. There you go, you can clearly see the saturated texture. There's a lot of moisture in there now, so we need to let it dry for a few hours. This time, I let it dry overnight. The next day, I came back to this. It was nice and dry. You can test it with your finger. Listen to that texture. Yummy. It's time to paint, but first up, we need to prime it. I used my airbrush for this, but using a rattle can would have been a lot quicker, and I mean a lot. Make sure you get the primer on all the surfaces. Some of the grit texture likes to hide from it sometimes, so don't let it. Cover all the textures in glorious primer. I love how it all comes together at the priming stage. So to paint the shelters, I took a green paint and mixed in a little black. I then applied it to all the roofs of the shelters. I left a little bit of primer in the gaps between the panels. When that was dry, I then used just the green and repainted those same areas with a stippling effect. I thinned the paint a fair bit to get a little translucency. I then took a little beige off-white paint and added it to the green. Using this new colour mix, I repeated the process. I tried to make sure each layer has some of the previous layer showing through. For the last layer, I used quite a lot more beige for the final highlight. This one I thinned down a lot more so you could see all the previous layers. If I had to do all of this again, I would probably just use a flathead dry brush or a sponge and stipple it on with that. To paint the doors, I first used a yellow paint, in this case Avalon Sunset, and gave them a couple of coats. I think the green and yellow colour contrast looks quite snazzy. I then mark out some hazard stripes with some thinned down black paint. I tried to take my time with this, but was always aware they were going to get a lot of weathering and washes. Using the guidelines from the previous step, I then thickened the hazard stripes up. They are not perfect. If you wanted, you could mask them or something and do a really good straight job. I didn't. Moving on to the base, I began by giving the texture a heavy overbrush with an earth coloured paint. This one I think was Vallejo Flat Earth, and I do love this brown. When it's all applied and wet, it looks a little bit like melted chocolate. I wouldn't advise trying to eat it though. When that's all dry, we can move on. I then did a dry brush with a beige paint. I wasn't too worried about getting the amount of paint perfect. It is a base after all, and a bit of variation can help with some realism. At this stage, I also like to paint the edges of the base. Nobody wants to see bare cardboard. Well, I don't think they do. Do they? I then applied some washes. I watered down some black paint, my beige paint, and some Hull red, and applied these liberally to the whole thing multiple times. I did leave it to dry between layers. This step is great fun. When that's all dry, it looks a little like this. Those darker patches are sponged on thicker washes that dried kind of like tide marks. I kept them as I like them. You could leave it there if you like, but I wanted to add some flock. I wanted a few different tones, so first off I painted on some glue and sprinkled my first flock tone into the glue patches. When you've been around the whole thing, tip the excess off. We then repeat the same process with a different tone of flock. This time it's a lighter tone. I really like the colour of this one. Again, when done, tip off the excess. I also decided to add some grass tufts. I have this old set of Mordheim turf tufts. I'm not sure if they sell it anymore, but there's loads of different alternatives out there now. Some are in funky colours like pink and purple. Apply a little glue where you want the tuft, stick the tuft on the glue, and give it a poke with a stick to make sure it beds down, as it were. I added a few of these all around the base. I really like the look these give, especially when mixed in with the different tones of flock. And when the glues on your flock and tufts are dry, your scenery is complete. Ready to save the lives of some poor Imperial citizens during a Genestealer cult uprising, or perhaps for some Chaos cultists to hide from an Imperial Navy bombardment. You can use the shelters as just line of sight blocking terrain, or even use them as actual bunkers with rules if you fancied it. The world, as they say, is your oyster. I decided at the end to go back in and paint some glowing lights on the buttons, but that's a little trick I think I will show off in a later video. If you want to see it, of course, let me know in the comments below. So there you have it, the Oldhammer style scratch built space shelters terrain. Or should we call them bunkers? Are they bunkers or shelters? I don't actually know. So what did you think of those? Do you think these space shelters are big enough to use, or do you think I should have made them a bit bigger? Would you like to see some more terrain tutorial videos? If so, let us know. Let us know in the comments below. If I do make some more terrain, what would you like to see me make next? I'm thinking maybe just a board, or maybe some trees. Some Oldhammer style trees would be great. Those polystyrene jungle things with the spikes sticking out. I quite fancy those. When was the last time you made some terrain? What was the last piece of terrain you made? Scratch built? None of that off the shelf business? Well, I guess you can use the off the shelf plastic stuff for detailing. I think they're handy for that. Have you ever made a whole table's worth of terrain? And if you did, what was the theme? Was it a city fight urban theme, or perhaps you made a jungle themed base using a lot of IKEA plants as your jungle? All in all, I'm actually quite happy with how these turned out, although I did say I think they're a little small, being Pringles. Next time I might use a coffee can or some of those Twiglets or mini cheddar tins you get around Christmas time. They're similar, but a bit fatter and wider, around that sort of size. I'd probably also like to add a little more detail, maybe a fence running around the outside, or some more buttons on the doors. I definitely next time want to add more filler around this area here, because it's just a little too flat for me. I like a big chunky base. Maybe I should use a polystyrene sort of cap on top of the baseboard. However, one thing I did do was enjoy the build, and I definitely now want to make some more. If you enjoy the content on this channel, then please consider joining the Patreon, the link to which is in the description below. If you want to see some more tutorials, and I know you do, then check out the playlist up here somewhere. As always, thank you very much for watching, and always remember to drill your barrels.